Awesome, and we're live. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the second Fireside Chat of 2021. I'm your host, Andrew Weiner, Head of Partnerships here at iComply Investor Services. iComply is a global software provider of KYC and AML identity and risk management solutions for financial institutions, brokers, corporate and legal services, accounting, gaming, and today's topic, e-commerce and virtual marketplaces. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment and let our panel of our friends introduce themselves, starting with the window directly below me this time. We're going to go in a reverse order this week.
Hi, I'm Amber Scott. I'm the founder of Outlier Compliance Group, or Outlier Solutions, as our name is technically. And we are a compliance consulting firm, primarily anti-money laundering and privacy. I'm also a big tech geek.
Thank you, Amber. We're also joined by our friend to my right.
And I'm Gene DeMira. I'm the Chief Identity Officer, not Information Officer, but Identity Officer for the AML shop. And that is because I really am passionate about the intersection between the fight against financial crime and AML guidelines and the different identity solutions that are available out in the marketplace, and raising awareness of those solutions and helping the kind of the Tinder of between technology and our clients into that mix, and trying to find the right fit for the different tools for across the different reporting entities in the Canadian marketplace.
Now, for our viewers tuning in from YouTube, we invite you to ask our panel of compliance matchmakers a question at any time. You can also find today's chat on both LinkedIn Live and on Twitter at iComplyIS. So the title of today's event is The New Consumer: How to Ensure Integrity in the Virtual Economy. And to set the stage for our audience, why are we talking about this? E-commerce has been growing steadily for the past decade as online shopping platforms and digital payment processors are becoming more widely available in both previously inaccessible or underserved markets around the world. As one example, in 2019, figures showed that over the online holiday weekend, the sales around the world online reached about $138.65 billion US. But then in 2020, this figure was toppled as sales soared to $201.32 billion. This 45% increase in growth for online sales was not expected by any experts until at the earliest 2022. And this is evidence that consumers are turning increasingly to virtual marketplaces in favor of the brick and mortar storefront shopping experience that we were all accustomed to growing up. The pandemic continues to disrupt walk-in retail traffic of businesses around the world. Events and climate change is also forcing people into increasingly remote situations. So this is a great time to discuss this as a group. So who are these consumers and where are these marketplaces? Well, companies like Airbnb, Etsy, Amazon, and similar have requirements, responsibilities to identify, screen, and monitor the users, merchants, and transactions occurring across their platforms. Further down that value chain, payment processors, logistical and shipping companies, and even the manufacturers bear some level of responsibility in knowing who they are servicing and who they are accepting money from in a completely remote landscape. So today, we're going to address on the panel, what are the responsibilities within these different, let's say, links of the value chain, and how does a platform, its payment processors, its banking partners, its merchants, and more perform KYC and AML at scale to support the scope of their operation and the projected growth that's coming year over year. So I'm going to start with Amber today. Amber, from the audience, how does a traditional e-commerce platform differ from the more sophisticated virtual marketplaces we've seen in the last couple of years?
I think that there are a ton of changes, both in terms of how the content is delivered, the types of payment mechanisms that exist. And so we're not necessarily just talking about a traditional credit card payment. We have e-wallets, we have virtual currencies. There are all different types of payment mechanisms. There is very rapidly deployable cross-border, multilingual, multi-jurisdictional type support that I think was unusual in the early days of commerce. And then there's just such a wide number of platforms. And so there are, for both legal and illegal purposes, commerce platforms that exist within messaging applications like Telegram. And this could be to buy anything from sneakers to cocaine, depending on what it is that you're looking for. So I think there's a difference in terms of the visibility of those platforms. There's a difference in terms of the reach of those platforms. When Jean and I worked together, we were bankers together back in the day. And at that point in time, I remember joining Facebook because I needed to understand how the bank was using Facebook to reach customers. There are so many different sales deployments that are happening now within just the Facebook application itself, from sales groups to groups within Messenger. It's staggering, just the different mechanisms that exist. And I think that's very different from anything that we saw previously, where it was very much, I go to a web page and buy from merchant, or I go to Amazon and buy from a variety of different merchants.
Excellent. And, a follow-up on that question, just kind of bridging out. So when we think about, let's say, like a Craigslist, Jean, what would be the difference in structure and kind of responsibility between like a Craigslist platform or something a little more sophisticated and embedded, like an Etsy?
Well, I'm kind of thinking beyond the one-off type of transactions, right? So a lot of times Craigslist, he ends up seeing the one-off, but you don't really know if they're a one-off, or if that's somebody that bought a whole bunch of extra inventory from places or did some importing and then selling it like a one-off type of a piece. And same thing with a lot of the Etsy pieces versus a virtual storefront in those elements. Even Amazon and Shopify, I actually participated in this as a side business that our family had, a proper legal side business last year that we closed down due to COVID, where we're doing fundraising using basically as fundraising for charities with a variety of different items that we purchased from auctions and other online sources, and then redoing them, reselling them using Shopify and all of these other different tools. So it's really an eye-opener of how easy it is. You could have a storefront up and running within, for any entity or supposed entity, within hours. And you can have a huge inventory going, and then you could even be plugged into a lot of the different merchant networks and the like for clearing things. So if it's that easy to do, then it's also that easy to mask things. Are those real transactions going through the network? Who are you dealing with on the other side? And how are they documenting things related to, or not documenting things related to the Canada Revenue Agency or other means? Or are they inflating different transactions and embedding different proceeds of crime in order to mask them in trade-based money laundering, which is the hardest tool to crack? So a lot of these pieces, these platforms, I think there's going to be a transition of trust is what we'll see. People are going to want to know more and more of who they're dealing with on the other side, but it also depends on what the product is. If it's much more of a commodity type thing, or something that they want to make sure it doesn't break 6 months later, 9 months later, a year later. Even things like Kickstarter programs, like you get what you get from a Kickstarter program. So if that technology worked for 3 days and then it broke, there's no warranty behind it. It is what it is. So sometimes you'll luck out, and sometimes it is something that will be very reliable and you'll be thrilled with because you got that great deal. So it'll be interesting to see where the market continues to grow and where they choose to lay their trust.
Now, Amber, to build on that, from a compliance perspective, is there a lot more involved between having like a P2P type of platform like Craigslist, or going with a B2C model that includes merchants, payments processors, and just so many other players in the value chain? Kind of where do you start there in terms of the difference of compliance and friction for the users you're going to have?
I think there's always so much of and it depends. So it depends on what the exact business model is. It's not just that it's business to business or business to consumer, but it's really, what are you selling? Where are you selling it? Where are your customers? And what does this look like? And this is the interesting point of friction that always exists, is that from a technology perspective, I can go poof and hit a few buttons and deploy whatever it is that my store or my service is, that doesn't mean that I've met all of the obligations that I have from a compliance perspective. And that's really different. We've seen some relatively big companies in the merchant space, in the payment processing space, that got themselves in trouble, particularly around OFAC. And so this is US regulation specific to sanctions, where they have specially designated individuals and entities. And if you are doing something that connects one of those persons or entities that is sanctioned with a US merchant, with a US banking service, with some kind of, and I know it's not specific to US dollar payments, but most US dollar payments are going to go through the US banking system in some form at some point. And so there are really these knock-on effects where you have to be aware. And it might seem like something, but it's innocuous. I'm just doing payment processing for a company that's, shipping refurbished sneakers. That's fine. But you have to be aware that if you're facilitating the transfer of payment and sneaker between the US and North Korea, you're offside with OFAC. And that it seems like a really innocent thing that you don't have to pay attention to. We saw a penalty for a payment processor just a couple weeks ago, I think, that was with the reduction for all of their cooperation, still 5 times more than the amount of money that they transferred. That was a great cameo.
I'm so sorry for that interruption. So with that example, it does remind me of kind of this Huawei case that we saw in the news recently, where cell phones found their way through a supply channel to a sanctioned country. And, what type of controls could have been in place potentially to manage that better, to, prevent this type of, redistribution to where your product that originated from, a non-sanctioned country ended up somewhere that it's not supposed to be. Who pays the penalties in that problem, and who have the responsibility there to make sure that didn't happen? Is it, the cell phone company? Is it, the distribution channels? Is it the marketplace that you would have bought it from? I'd love to hear your perspective there on kind of what that should have looked like.
Like, if I could jump in on this one, I think the fun thing there is you're jumping into now what is really a political and philosophical debate as much as anything. Because with globalization, we now have international touch points all over the place and international fabrication. Well, who's to say that the sanctions laws and requirements that are imposed on one marketplace ends up having that extraterritorial effect? So it's a matter of, do you end up having a social contract with your people as a country that say, if anyone that's going to do business in this country is going to abide by this country's laws? And that includes international players. Let it be known, international players, if you're going to play in our space, you need to abide by our rules globally and apply to that globally. Because in that scenario that you specified, but there's many others that are similar to that, if they're an international player, and we often hear about this, like with the concept of offshore. Oh my God, people have these offshore companies everywhere. That's so horrible. Well, why is that horrible? Like, if a company has business in another country and sells everything in another country and makes money in another country, there's no law that says thou shalt repatriate that money back to your home jurisdiction. So they keep the money offshore until they want to repatriate it, and then they pay their taxes when they repatriate it. So that's the big issue there. That's a legal piece, but that's an ethical element too, in that there's no law that they're breaking. There's no reasonable grounds that forces them to do that. It's just what they're choosing to do to be efficient for their shareholders. Same thing happens in sanctions, in that if you end up having laws across that, then it's a matter of making it being known up front to say that any company that's cooperating in this jurisdiction in Canada needs to abide by all of our country norms, regardless of where you are, and then impose that. But policing that is next to impossible, because how does that Canadian operation even know what's going on in that foreign area? So that's where some of those challenges lie. And when it comes to imposing extraterritoriality, obviously the United States is best known for that, and they have the biggest tools in their tool chest for that and the resources to do it as well. That's the other piece, is you could say a certain law is this, but do you have the resources to enforce it? And that's the other challenge. For honest organizations, the ones that we work with, typically, like, we say this is how you need to manage to that. And even though it's difficult, and some of our customers may complain to say, but my competition in that far off land doesn't have to do that. Well, your competition at far off land isn't participating in Canada, and these are the rules by being in Canada. I'm definitely excited about Amber's thoughts on this one too.
I think there's sort of the philosophical, ethical, esoteric argument that almost has to be separated from the practical argument. And that's something that I feel happens a lot, particularly at the intersection of compliance and technology, which is to say that philosophically, I might think that certain things should be the case. And choose your flavor of that, whether it be harm reduction or code as law or anything that you like. But there are things that maybe I think should be the case. There are times where I might look at the existing law and policy and think that it is likely to just come up with a terrible outcome a la Cobra effect, which is one of my favorite bad policy examples, where a government decided there were too many cobras, so they would offer a bounty for the heads of cobras, which was great until people started breeding cobras. So there was never a decline in the cobra population, but they paid out a lot of people. And then when they stopped paying out, people just let all the cobras go. Exactly the opposite of what you wanted. So this can happen from a policy perspective. And I think as businesses and as policy wonks, as compliance geeks, we have to pay attention to that piece of it and push for better law. We have to push for better policy. And that's a very high level esoteric part of it, but we have to pair that with how do we practically comply with what we have today? How do we meet our existing requirements as they are written, as our regulators expect of us to meet these requirements? And those are sometimes very different conversations, because I might not like philosophically what the law is telling me to do, but ultimately I've chosen to be in that particular arena. I have chosen to do a particular type of business, a particular type of commerce, and so and to operate in specific jurisdictions. And so I'm beholden to the laws of those jurisdictions. And I think this is an interesting part of that conversation, in that we do see companies that choose not to operate in particular jurisdictions because they don't want to be beholden to the laws of those jurisdictions, or they don't understand them, or it's maybe in conflict with their home jurisdiction, because that happens. And I think that that's relatively important. One of the things that I will say is that where that type of decision is made, it's still incumbent on you to make a process to make sure that you're not actually dealing in those jurisdictions. So for instance, if I'm saying, I don't understand OFAC, I don't know how it works, so I'm not going to serve US merchants or customers, fine. But do I have something to make sure downstream that I'm not actually doing that piece? And something more substantial than just a tick box that says, no, I am not a US customer, but then I have things shipped from my US warehouse. So there does need to be something substantial that's happening if you're saying that you're not dealing in particular ways. And you can't ignore the evidence that you are doing something that contravenes. So this is the interesting piece that came up in the case that I was referring to earlier, where there had been a penalty. People were attesting to compliance. They were doing screening against the lists, but then they were collecting data like IP addresses, and they weren't paying attention to it. And there were North Korean IP addresses, and there were Iranian IP addresses. Well, sometimes people use VPNs, but probably when I'm choosing my VPN country, North Korea is not at the top of the list for where I'm pretending to be. So it seems highly unlikely that that was some kind of spoofing and someone pretending to be in this very highly sanctioned jurisdiction, as much as it was probably someone operating from this jurisdiction who had revealed their IP address. So those are things that you don't get to ignore, and that's really important. I think when you're looking at the laws that you're beholden to, part of it becomes, what are the data points that I'm collecting organically, and where might I realize that I could be offside with something or not? And this isn't a one and done. This isn't a, you've looked at my IP address on day one where I connected from a Canadian IP address, and thereafter I was connecting from a North Korean IP address, and you get to ignore that. Or you screened my name on day one, but I wasn't a listed person. But day 5, it comes out that I've been involved in some nefarious activity, and now I am appearing on those lists. So what does that look like from a continuous refresh basis? And that's really important. I think that's where the technology piece is absolutely key.
And I think if I could lead off that a little bit more too, the other interesting piece, getting back to the philosophical, is where are we touching through proceeds of crime, proceeds of corruption, proceeds of sanctions, and those elements versus human rights elements? Because in some regards, let's say if I am a dual citizen of Canada and a country which was previously, that is currently sanctioned, what does my citizenship with that country have to do with anything? I may have left that country when I was 3 years old. And have zero relations of financial ties to it. But some organizations are taking citizenship as a data point. What happens if I have family members in that country, or if I have family members that are with Doctors Without Borders is a great classic, easy example, where they could be in these very risky areas, but they're doing good, right? So all of those different elements. Andrew, you're on mute if you wanted to join in on that.
I think you raise a really interesting point, is like, what is the implication for a Red Cross worker that is stuck somewhere, that needs kind of that digital connection to his life back home in a non-sanctioned country where he still has rent to pay. He still has,
and we do have tools in financial services for those very specific examples. But how about the examples whereby you just simply have family members back there for a variety of different means, and you have a life insurance payment that you want to take care of family in an impoverished area, but no one has any way of getting the money back to them. There's been like life insurance claims with sanctioned areas, and you have to go through so many different hoops to get that money back there in a fair way. And the way the current ministerial directive is written, FINTRAC knows about every single one of them. What does it have to do with reasonable grounds to suspect related to any form of proceeds of crime, any form of proceeds of terrorism, any form of sanction? Nothing. But right now, if you have practically any nexus, depending on how you read that ministerial directive, you need to report that to FINTRAC. Well, where's the privacy commissioner coming in and saying, why did the Minister of Finance give that ministerial directive? Now, FINTRAC is just following its regulatory laws. So I'm not blaming the organization, but what I am calling out is how they're interpreting that, and the minister and how they're putting the language around those directives in order to make sure that are we striking the right balance when it comes to things. So the focus that I like to give, and I like to preach and the like, and in the work I've done with FATF in the past, was financial ties to geographic risk, financial ties to things. So if you're a tax resident of both countries, hey, you know what? Game on. We got to take a look at all the traceability. How do I know that all of those interactions are working? You're claiming you have financial ties. You're giving that information to the Canada Revenue Agency in the common tax reporting form, and then that's going back to those other countries. So game on with regards to if you have financial ties or you're a tax resident of these both jurisdictions and the like. But if it's the incidental contacts, the one-off payments, that's where financial institutions are often put in a really tough position into that mix. And these ancillary points, I'm kind of curious about the pendulum swinging of privacy versus secrecy versus privacy versus business need, and giving the right amount of information. Because right now the pendulum's going a little bit back towards, no, we need the IP address, we need the usernames, we need all the intersections and touch points. But then it's not going to be long, I think, before the privacy commissioner sneaks back in and says, wait a second, are you really relevant on all that information? And that can hamper us too in protecting our customers. Because what happens if there's an account takeover of somebody from one of these high-risk jurisdictions, and they're like, why didn't you catch that account takeover, financial institution? Like, I don't live in this far off place. And all that stuff.
You have these great examples from your time in banking and your time at Manulife where these things were happening, because when we talk about virtual marketplaces in a general sense, most people think goods. Most people think, merchant stores or peer-to-peer or something like this. But the new consumers are also, as you guys just mentioned, going after just services. And sometimes things like life insurance are services administered digitally today, as well as health insurance and all sorts of other things that go beyond what we traditionally know as the marketplace, which is I'm a customer, there's a business or another person, and we're transacting. But now there's these implications of this international scope of all of these different types of digital services. So we've got goods, we've got services, we've got even entertainment now with Cameo. It's very big news now that Tom Cruise is on Cameo, but he isn't on Cameo, because the lack of a liveness check has allowed a deep fake to sell Tom Cruise videos on Cameo right now. This is happening today. It's a very relevant real world example. And now finally, so we've got goods, we've got services, we've got entertainment, assets. We have not talked about assets yet. And as we're seeing in the marketplaces, there are so many exchanges that have hit since 2016. Some are no longer here. There are a lot of great reasons from the compliance perspective as to why. But for those that have remained, and Amber, I'll throw this question to you because I know that you have consulted for so many of the players in that space. What does that value chain look like for an assets platform, let's say operating in North America as a use case? What is their partner network look like? Is there payment processors, wallets? Can you speak to that?
Complicated and occasionally uncertain, both from a regulatory and access to traditional banking services perspective. So I think to break that down a little bit, there's nothing that changes by virtue of something being digitally native. And I think what you were referring to in terms of a lot of these virtual assets no longer existing was the idea that we had things that were ICOs, so initial coin offerings, where they would launch and they would essentially be a security just masquerading under another name. And securities commissions around the world took umbrage with that. They take umbrage with that regardless of where you decide to have your incorporation if you're serving people in that jurisdiction. And I think that's one of the important things that shook out of that. In the early days, we had people saying, but it's just code on the internet. So it's fine. It's not a security. There were lawyers, many of whom I hope have lost their licenses for suggesting that it would be otherwise. But there were certainly people that were willing to take the money and write a memo to say, oh, yes, it's all fine. And this is not a security. So I think that's part of the important piece that comes out of that, is that it's really important to pay attention to what an asset is, how it evolves, and where you're rolling it out. By virtue of being virtual or digital, it doesn't change it. It doesn't change your obligation. So a security by any other name is still a security. That said, I think we struggle with what does the path to compliance look like, because there are elements in the traditional securities world, like custodians, that don't really exist in the same mature way in the virtual asset world. So we're starting to see them, particularly out of New York with BitLicense. And while I'm not necessarily a fan of that law specifically, I think it has forced in a slice of the industry to get very mature very quickly, and has forced a path to compliance within the state. And so we see a lot of Canadian companies that are relying on custodians in New York because they've already hit these measures. where we don't necessarily have the same maturity in terms of custodians in the Canadian context. The other thing that I think gets really fascinating, and I find, regardless of what you think of Tether, I find Tether to be just a really interesting case in terms of how difficult it is to have certainty in a context where there's not access to the traditional banking system. And so Tether is a virtual currency, a stable coin. So the idea is that it's pegged to the US dollar, and it was supposed to be collateralized one-to-one. So one Tether equals one US dollar somewhere in a bank. That was not always the case throughout their history. And part of the issue was that they were dealing with these high-risk payment processors and these high-risk institutions, some of which disappeared with some of the money along the line, which is an unfortunate place to be. But I think that one of the places that we need to do better is pairing that access for emerging technologies and emerging asset classes to the traditional banking system, because ultimately that allows for better monitoring, that allows for better understanding of what these companies are actually doing. I think when you have nested relationships where you have a payment processor that's doing processing for another payment processor, and neither one of them are really regulated from an AML perspective, you get into these relationships where essentially no one's watching. And so no one has the sense that they're really beholden to any particular regulation. It's really difficult for banks and regulators to tell what the underlying transactions are. They're all bundled and nested together. And it just becomes incredibly difficult to deal with from an intelligence perspective. And I think that becomes easier where there's less friction in those relationships themselves. I would love to see a world where there just isn't a true market for what I think of today as being high-risk payment processors. So the types of payment processors that charge a premium to deal with the business that no one else does. I would like to just see there not be a market for that, because everyone can find smoother, more traditional relationships where they are better monitored, frankly.
This segues into the very next question. You've raised a great point here. So you've got, a couple of people in your value chain that have a responsibility of performing these checks, but who checks the checkers? How, as a platform, if I'm an Etsy, would I manage the KYC and AML data potentially coming from both the payment processors facilitating these transactions, the financial payments and the behavior of the financial payments, as well as the merchants who are managing the user behavior? Because we kind of have two different types of data points here. We have the real identity, person, and risk, and then we have the way they actually behave in this digital environment. Gene, do you want to take that away with how, as a platform, you might manage those controls and actually scale the ability to do this properly?
Oh, so many things to say there. Hold myself back. First off, when you're talking about AML and who checks the checkers, one thing that is an interesting and exciting development out of Australia is, and I think this came through a couple of kind of redirection scandals from regulators, is that there's now kind of a code and or kind of some minimum standards being looked at related to consulting firms that provide support for AML purposes to make sure, are they properly trained? Do they have an adequate experience and background? Are they giving good advice into that mix? And I think it's fantastic. I think organizations like Amber's and ours will do extremely well if you had more of that, of those that do effectiveness testing on these different pieces. One of the nuances, though, is that you've got a couple things in your sentence there that are not always full and complete. Do all payment processors necessarily have stringent obligation and oversight at a custodian level of integrity? And are they checked? Are they regulated? Are they kept on top of? And I don't think the answer is yes. to that. I don't think, like, I think a lot of them may say, oh, no, we do all these AML things for our banks. Otherwise, we lose our accounts, we lose our business and everything else. But really, do they in all instances? Like I've seen, there's been some good examples there, but I think that there could be a bit more in how much is involved in the custodianship. But even they're also not necessarily, I don't mean to be throwing them under the bus, but there's also the information that comes to them from the networks themselves. There's the identity frameworks more upstream. And I think further to Amber's last point of, we got to get rid of these high risk players that are willing to bend the rules for particular clients that lets organized crime kind of sneak in. We need inclusion. We need better inclusion. We need better identity. I think one of the latest stats I saw was there's between 1 and 1.2 billion people on this planet that have zero verifiable foundational identity. Like, so for a lot of emerging markets, their cell phone is their identity. That is 100% their identity. And that cell phone is shared amongst like 3 families. So how does that work? Right. So these are the pieces that I think that we have to see, how do we bridge that? And with the globalized market, that family that has that type of relationship may have a lot of great relationships in North America or in Europe or other places where they have strong identity and they're making payments to those more challenging environments. So how do you work through that? So those are the pieces that I personally agree with Amber, and it's better inclusion and identity, better inclusion in AML information to make sure that we're moving away from a check the box to that risk-based approach. And if that means we let microtransactions go through and AML, sorry, you're not going to catch those microtransactions, that we're going after the big fish. Let's all agree that we're going to go after the big fish. But then the challenge is a lot of human trafficking is not in those big transactions. A lot of really bad harm that happens needs to be through intelligence and better identity scrubbing upstream in order to defeat some of those ills that our planet has. So I kind of went on a few different tangents there. Hopefully I covered some of the big pieces. I think that the challenge is you can't just put all of the data into one pot, because that one pot will be so many different flavors, you wouldn't be able to tell one from another. B, the quality of the ingredients, you're going to be throwing in things into that are literally dirt and not food into that pot. Sorry, another bad analogy from Gene. You might want to tick how many you get those, my friend Andrew. And so I think we're going to have to do through intelligence, through pulling them into the network in the smart way, do risk-based approaches, sectoral-based approaches. We need to do more academic study in these things and start and giving them the right tools at the right economy to make these things happen, to be successful. I think the great news is that technology is evolving. FATF is paying attention to payment processors more and more. The regimes are paying attention more and more. So I think we're going to see a lot of movement, but we got to be at the table and have the participants at the table in that movement for it to be successful. It can't be unidirectional or we're all going to fail.
I think you hit the nose right on the head in talking about the risk-based approach. And that's one of the things that the FATF has really started to lean into. That was the sum total of the opening remarks from their last plenary session, was really that we are transitioning to a risk-based approach. Countries are expected to transition to a risk-based approach. So it's not a tick box approach. It's not a one size fits all. And we do have to look at what the trade-offs are in terms of the approaches that we're taking, because every approach will have a trade-off. I think the piece about financial inclusion is incredibly important. I don't know what that's going to look like in the long term, but I know, and this is one of those more esoteric philosophical issues, but I know even within the Canadian context, we have specific institutions that aim to make it easier for people that are dealing with particular disabilities, that are dealing with housing instability, that are dealing with mental health issues, to access basic banking services. And sometimes this means that those people aren't meeting that basic AML, here's what I need. because that's really difficult to do if you're of no fixed address. That's really difficult to do when your primary residence is a psychiatric care unit where you've been, but you still have some basic needs that can be addressed through banking services. And we do have institutions that have taken the tack that they are accepting the risk at certain lower transactional levels, at certain lower account balance levels. They're considering those accounts to be high risk. They're monitoring them, which I think is important when you get to the perspective of issues like human trafficking, because sometimes those same populations are at risk. There are absolutely correlations between people ending up trafficked and experiencing housing instability, for instance. And so we have these same vulnerable populations, but they're not necessarily at risk of being a money laundering kingpin in so much as they're at risk of being a victim of crime. And I think that it's important that we are managing and acknowledging those. And I absolutely salute the institutions that are pushing on those fronts to be able to find mechanisms for financial inclusion. It's certainly something that I'm happy when I see from bigger institutions, in that they have the clout, so to speak, to be able to push that agenda. They have the ability to bring those lawyers to the table and the budget to do that if that's what it comes to.
And I can't agree more. And I'll give an example that also mirrors that too, in that organizations are now, they either have the tools or they should have the tools to be able to address financial inclusion pieces and empower them. Like the example that I give is, I'm sure all of you remember, is that there was a short time ago that Syria, at the very beginning of some of the tragedies that happened there, there's mass migration in the millions that hit a number of different jurisdictions. And when Germany got hit with literally hundreds of thousands at their border, they did not have a wallet on them. They did not have ID cards on them or anything that had integrity. So they literally had to issue a new identity using biometrics, and they did it smart with NFC, with smart cards and everything else. And they gave them money because they had to survive. They put them up in different places. And I still remember stories whereby within 48 hours, the financial institutions that were managing this already had detected payments that were going to persons that had ties to terrorism within 48 hours. So there's an ancient proverb of trust in Allah, but tie up your camel. Or trust but verify is another thing. If you want to go American, I think that was a statement from Ronald Reagan related to the nuclear arms piece. Trust but verify. There's so many different variations of the same that we need to give trust to our most those that we need to that deserve it in related to the financial inclusion piece. People that need a second chance or third chance or fourth chance, that may not be empowered in the same way due to a variety of different means. But it doesn't mean that we have to throw away all of our controls and supports. It just means we have to do that extra effort to make sure that we can continue to give that trust away. And just because we had that compromise doesn't mean you shut down the program. Like, that's the easy answer. We can't be easy. We have to work hard on this. And we have to think outside the box to deliver these solutions. And hard isn't easy, but exactly, it's opposite, right? So, but we have the capability of doing it. We've got a lot of smart technology providers. We have a lot of smart compliance professionals, and they're just that. They're professionals. And I think the compliance disciplines have reached that level of maturity that we can take our game up a notch and challenge each other's.
I really want to add some data here to illustrate these points you both have just made about the opportunities and kind of that moral responsibility around banking the unbanked and providing services to the underserved. Right now, according to the Office of the UN, we've got 195 sovereign countries regulated, and then we have 60 dependent jurisdictions. Now, when we think of some of these dependent jurisdictions, Myanmar kind of falls into this category right now. They're in the middle of the top. And their access to financial services, all of the bankers have been replaced by military. Men that were holding a machine gun last week are in the branch with a pen today. And when you think about kind of what that implication is for those citizens going forward, they're going to need these digital marketplaces and this access to all of these channels and infrastructure to kind of get back on track of normalcy as they continue to feel the disruption of that type of situation. Now, that's a very unique case, but we see, in the Emirates, we see in Africa, we see in parts of Asia that there, as many as 60 different countries that simply don't have the infrastructure, the means, and the controls to participate in these systems yet. What does that mean? That means the opportunity still exists for an entrepreneur, for a fantastic consultant, for a great compliance as a service agency, and all the players in the value chain of partners that we have to seize and make this happen, not just to make money, but to do something incredible for the world. To let's get that 195 number to 255 or whatever the number of territories is popularly recognized today. And I think you guys raised some great points on that. Is that's really where the opportunity is, and that there can be so many different marketplaces. There can be goods, there can be services, there could be entertainment, there could be, in the case of assets and securities, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. If we saw 45% growth year over year from 2019 to 2020, I can only imagine what's going to happen at the end of this year as we continue to be in lockdown as a world.
So Amber, do you mind if I jump in on that Myanmar pace item? I kind of have a bit of research I've done in that area for a little bit and some interesting nuances there.
Oh, amazing. Please do.
So Myanmar is a very interesting case. It's not an easy one for people to just read the headlines and then give an opinion. Because if you do that, I think you're missing really 90% of the story. Like it's like you're really watching a trailer instead you've seen the whole movie. The interesting nuance of Myanmar, and the example that you gave, I think would be one that is a perspective that people will have, that the military own all of the financial institutions in Myanmar, is a perspective that you'll have if you read a whole, let's say 10 different news articles on it. Because the Tatmadaw is owned and controlled by the military. They do own it. They do have control over some of the financial institutions in Myanmar, but there is a government infrastructure there in play, and it's a very delicate balance. It's a very large country. I believe, if I remember correctly, about 55 million people, multiple different distinct provinces and regions that all have their own very distinct societies and cultures in them, with a very storied history that includes colonial rule and the like, and a lot of influence from Japan, a lot of influence from China. And there's a lot of complexity, and they're trying to be their own people in many ways. And the corruption there isn't solely the military side. It's actually in all sides, in many sides. And I'm not trying to justify, please don't take this any justification of some of the extremely challenging events that have happened there. There's no excuse for any of that, but it is an interesting and very young society and an amazing opportunity. Just as we saw the revival of Japan after World War II to become such an amazing G7 country, I think Myanmar there can be hope in that organization. But what do? Do you shut down your conversation, and then do you preach on high saying you need to do this, you need to do that? Canada's trade with Myanmar, if I'm not mistaken, was less than a few $1 million in the last few years. Like it was insignificant. So if your trade is insignificant with a country, and you go to that country and you say, well, you should do better, you should not do this, you should not do that, why would they listen to you? You're not investing in them. You're not investing in their people. You're not being there for them in their time of need. So that's where I personally respect that global trade has an important place, but it needs to be done right. And it needs to be done right in a way to empower people to help build their infrastructure. Canada is quite proud of its financial services infrastructure. Well, why don't we use some of that infrastructure, that knowledge, that expertise on how to do things right with ethics and human rights, and help organize countries like that and bring that infrastructure in play and help teach them on how to do things with governance and ethics? They have boards of directors in Myanmar. They have laws and rules and different structures, but they've also had a history of different forms of political corruption. And that's why the military keeps on, that gives the military the out to constantly go in and grab power. Their elite class there, other people can compare to our elite class of law firms and our law firms intertwining with government politicians. Like if you take a look at how all of our elite law firms and their interaction with our politicians, well, our elite law firms have a lot of great brain trust. There's a lot of brilliant people there. It's great that we have those brilliant people in our government helping lead. Mm-hmm. So these things are naturally going to be intertwined. That's what their case is there. And I'm not trying to make any excuse for their government or those elements, but I'm just kind of calling out that there's a lot of complexity into that regime. And sanctions, I think you need to be more reactive. I think you need to invest as a government more in guidance around sanctions to give people the opportunity to improve financial inclusion, to interact with those different countries and lift them up. Because Myanmar today was many other countries from 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago, and other countries that may fail, that may be other countries that may happen in 2 years from now or 5 years from now. Who would have predicted what happened with Syria 10 years ago?
Right.
So that's kind of my rant on those pieces is I think that we have great opportunities ourselves to learn from it. I think our sanctions right now are very dull weapons in how they're executed. And I think we need to improve technology and improve interaction with industry to make them sharper and more effective in our interaction with the global market. And I think that could do a lot of great work with within our foreign affairs portfolios into the mix.
And we've highlighted a very key requirement here from the AML perspective that if you are going to serve one of these 60 dependent jurisdictions, if you've expanded your digital office to provide that there, PEPs and sanctions checks are going to be one of your primary weapons in fighting abuse and crime in a reality that looks like that. And ongoing monitoring, because as Amber brought up earlier, your data is great on day one, but it could be useless tomorrow. So you need to make sure that with these controls in place, you can start kind of opening up and moving into these places where this is going to be possible. And in countries where perhaps there's no digital ID standard yet, when really the passport is the only electronic source of truth, and then every other document in that structure is handwritten. This is going to be key, is creating that kind of facilitation to get people online, to get them in a secure portal in an environment, and to give them the means to transact and conduct services that today they just cannot reach, but they desperately require.
Yeah, but there's also some great opportunities in the Myanmar example. Just getting back to that, sorry, Amber, to squeeze in a rebuttal here, but they have some very intriguing mobile banking solutions that are tied straight to their passports that are stronger integrity of information and money flows than we have for a lot of our services in Canada. It's like how about getting verified banking here? Right? How about our verified banking tools here, right? And for some of them, right? It's kind of hard to get them sometimes. So those are the pieces that keep into the mix.
I'm sorry, Gene, can you repeat that, Amber? I didn't hear that.
Oh, sorry, Amber.
No, that's okay. That's okay, Gene. I was just saying you took the words right out of my mouth. I think there are going to be other jurisdictions that just absolutely leapfrog us and that are leapfrogging us in terms of the degree of digitization, the security standards that are applied to that digitization. Because in some cases, they'll be coming at it from a perspective where there just wasn't a pre-existing paper-based system. So they'll be building something that's in essence digitally native. And I think that has the ability to be incredibly powerful.
Great example of that proves your point. Estonia, digital residency, right? And we've seen so many companies create infrastructure there, get their licensing, set up what they needed, and now they're serving the EU, which, as we all know, has very unique privacy commissioner rules compared to the other countries in the world. It's almost as stringent as, let's say, the Emirates. You got to own your data, it can't leave the country. There's just so much implication there. before you even get to the verification and results, but how you even collect things from people and how you interact with your users.
Well, and Estonia is a great example of a fantastic set of powerful tools at the onset, which can empower your businesses, but it's also their tools. You need to then take a look at execution. You need to take a look at the right effectiveness testing from third parties that provide added support as well, because like take a look at Danske Bank, that in their Estonia branch ended up banking a whole slew of people from the Ukraine and Russia and other jurisdictions that were tied to organized crime and funneled tons of money through, and they had huge breakdowns. They knew exactly who they're dealing with because the technology was solid, but then they didn't act on it. so those are the pieces that I think it's still a good tales to tell, and it's fantastic. But the tools alone are not going to be utopia, but it does bring you closer a great deal, and it makes things easier. But you do need to strike that balance of people, process, and technology.
Yeah, that's always a good point. No matter what system you're using, you don't get to ignore the smoking gun.
And that's what keeps Amber and me employed.
200 entities lost their license for not respecting these controls in that jurisdiction. And it shows the kind of, although there was a real easy path to get started, there was a lot of control there. And the government was able to rectify and remediate. And, we're only going to see an increased model. People are going with the AML directives, improve their compliance. We've seen the latest FATF report. There's a lot of jurisdictions very close to being in the green, finally. And we're probably going to see more and more of these platforms come until lockdown goes away. And we may have fully trained a new consumer behavior for the rest of our lifetimes, as there are a lot of kids growing up today that have no experience of going to a retail store, which is kind of crazy to consider. That their formative years of teenagers, they've been locked down for 14, 15, 16 months. They may have their first job and they're working remotely. There's going to be very different types of buying behavior coming from those of us that have kind of gotten used to being cave people, in a sense. We've kind of gone back a millennia, and we're all back in our own caves. So with that said, I think that's a fun point to wrap up on. We covered a lot of great conversation today. We were able to answer every question from our audience, and I think that we've outlined some very key responsibilities, controls, and infrastructure and framework for somebody that's going to be starting a virtual marketplace for their partners in that value chain, and in some of the jurisdictions that they could be operating in. So I thank you both for your time today. To say goodbye, I'm going to throw it to Jean to start, to reverse the order again. Where can people find you, Jean? How do they get in touch?
Great. No, thanks again for the opportunity, and thank you for my wonderful and brilliant co-host, as always, co-panelist Amber. So the amlshop.ca is where you can find me, Jean, at the amlshop.ca, or on LinkedIn as well. By all means, make the connection there. And I'm always quite thrilled to talk the world of digital ID and financial crime, and enjoy these platforms. So thanks again for having me, and look forward to the next one. Take care.
And outliercanada.com for me. And my handle for most social media is @outliercanada.
As always, I appreciate your time, your attention, everybody for tuning in. Stay tuned. We will be announcing our next event coming up here shortly. Women in Compliance is our next theme. That will be my colleague Ashley Viens and myself, as well as some really exciting people from the industry. Everyone have a wonderful day. And until we see you again, you can find us online at iComplyIS.com and Twitter at iComplyIS.